Let me welcome our speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Nall, who's going to speak to us about the limits of science, why Einstein believes science needs the humanities.
We undoubtedly live during an age when our dominant educational institutions prioritize science and technology over the humanities. Such prioritization runs counter to the assessment of one of the greatest scientists in human history, Albert Einstein. In 1905, Einstein completed his PhD at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. He was 26 years old. That same year, Einstein published 4 pioneering scientific papers that brought a paradigm shift in physics. In a span of about 6 months, Einstein published a paper on the photoelectric effect, arguing that light might be a particle and not a wave. Another on Brownian motion, showing at least theoretical evidence for the actual existence of atoms. Another formulating his theory of special relativity, contending that time is relative to observers while the speed of light is constant. And fourth, developing the idea that mass and energy are equivalent as expressed in his famous equation E equals mc squared. Though this latest discovery would not only aid humanity in unlocking many foundational truths of our universe and its processes, it would also help unlock Pandora's box, as it allowed other scientists to recognize the possibility of harnessing unparalleled energy and the eventual creation of the atomic bomb. 10 years later, Einstein developed a theory of relativity explaining gravity as an effect rather than an independent force of its own. And in 1921, he earned the Nobel Prize in Physics. He was forced to immigrate from Germany to the United States in 1933 as Adolf Hitler was ascending to power, and he became a U.S. citizen in 1940. Now, I think it's interesting to note how Einstein's success contradicts the popular claim that human labor is only motivated by financial compensation and narrow specialization. Einstein authored 4 great works while working where? In a Swiss patent office. He wasn't getting paid for any of that scientific research. He wasn't motivated by money in that respect at all. During this time, what did he do? He regularly met with a circle of friends outside of work. He did his most important work outside of work, which is probably not a whole lot different from a lot of us. And he met and discussed science and philosophical works by thinkers including David Hume. Much of Einstein's work, it's interesting to note, because he is thought of as a scientist singularly, because we increasingly only really value science and technology. But it's important to note that most of the great discoveries of Einstein were theoretical. They were deployment of imaginative speculation and thought experiments, which were later put to the test by scientists in laboratories and then found to be some degree of correct or, and some modifications needed. But much of his work was done in his mind. Our contemporary education system urges students to take specialized knowledge tracks earlier and earlier in their academic career. Anyone with, teenage grandchildren or children knows this. Before they even exit high school, they're told to pick a path. At the age of 14 and 15, they're dual enrollment students by the time they're 16. They need to figure out, of course, what their major is going to be, what their career is going to be. In preference, the specialization in preference over generalized curriculums rooted in a generalized knowledge in the liberal arts. Albert Einstein was an early critic of what some today call the quote-unquote cult of the head start. This notion that if you get to running quickly in a particular destination, you will be more successful, you will be more knowledgeable. Long before high school students were expected to choose their professional trajectories, before they had fully matured as young adults, Einstein criticized this specialization in education in favor of a strong humanistic general education. In an October 15, 1936 speech on the subject of education, Einstein explained why he believed cultivating independent thinking skills should be the priority. He wrote, quote, "If a young man has trained his muscles and physical endurance by gymnastics and walking, he will later be fitted for every physical work. This is also analogous to the training of the mind and the exercising of the mental and manual skill. Thus, the wit was not wrong who defined education in this way, that, quote, education is that which remains if one has forgotten everything he learned in school," end quote. The wit that Einstein had in mind may very well have been that Unitarian-minded figure Henry David Thoreau, who in 1859, a journal entry wrote, "It is only when we forget all our learning that we begin to know. I do not get nearer by a hair's breadth to any natural object as long as I presume that I have an introduction to it from some learned man. To conceive of it with total apprehension, I must for the 1,000th time approach it as something totally strange," end quote. We could ask here just momentarily, why approach something familiar as though it were strange? Because we respect the dynamism of life in doing so, because we recognize our intellectual limits and wish to do more than lay claim to possessing, to having knowledge. We wish to know with aliveness, with a certain spirit of curiosity and humility. And in doing so, we once more enter into that sacred, and that would be the correct word, sacred communion with the world and all that we wish to understand. The rightful priority of schools should be, according to Einstein, helping students, quote, develop the general ability for independent thinking and judgment, or, in his words, independent critical thinking, and not promoting specialization of knowledge. One of the greatest scientists with specialized knowledge telling us, whatever you do, don't project onto young people an expectation that the most important thing is to have specialized knowledge. Don't do that if you want them to be great thinkers. I'm just saying it's worth thinking about Einstein's advice here. The person who develops their capacities to think and learn independently is, according to Einstein, quote, able to adapt himself to progress and changes compared to the person whose training primarily consists in acquiring the detailed knowledge. Someone who just possesses and holds facts that they've memorized, that they've performed well on some sort of scantron form and so forth. According to Einstein, generalizable thinking skills formed a foundation upon which any specialized interest could be built thereafter. What's more, a failure to cultivate originality and independence of thought in schooling would foster socially damaging standardization in people's thinking skills. Specifically, he was concerned at the United States schooling system of his day. I mean, so far removed. I mean, whatever you think about it today, I mean, just imagine Einstein is criticizing an education system nearly 100 years ago that he thought was deeply flawed and faulty. And all of his concerns, hyper-competitiveness, specialization, all of those have only been extremely exacerbated in our present. So if there was a criticism of them then my goodness, one can only think how we would apply those today. But he was particularly concerned with what he perceived as the unhealthy degree of competitiveness in the American education system of the 1940s, folks. He saw this as symptomatic of the cultural influence of capitalism. And so that's why he wrote in an essay titled, "Why Socialism?" Because, of course, he was an avowed socialist. He wrote the following: "This crippling of individuals I consider the worst evil of capitalism." We'd need a whole semester to just break that apart, because none of that makes sense in our contemporary culture. Einstein said that this crippling of individuals I consider the worst evil of capitalism. Again, you will think that I'm misreading that Einstein is clearly nuts, or that we really have lost our understanding of the impacts of this dominant economic system on our society. But in any case, he went on to say, our educational system suffers from this evil. An exaggerated competitive attitude is inculcated into the student who is trained to worship acquisitive success as a preparation for his future career, instead of a love of knowledge, a love of the natural world, a love of the communion with the universe. And call that sacred, don't call it sacred, but whatever that is, that was his inspiration, not money and not success. But we are told that those are the primary drivers of human beings. Einstein was saying, not of a fully developed person. Those are not the primary drivers. This emphasis on competitiveness diminished, according to Einstein, the individual, and put the individual into an unnatural state of antagonism with the rest of the community. In his address titled On Education, Einstein warned schools to avoid methods of inducing students to work that created or amplified their desires to, quote, be acknowledged as better, stronger, or more intelligent than their peers. I mean, that's half of the way in which the school system works today. To be the best, to get the best grades, that's not enough. We'll turn it up. You know, if you've ever seen Spinal Tap, they want to have a really loud amplifier, so they turn it up to 11. So we got GPAs going up all the way to 5. And then we have special cords you get to wear and special clubs you get to join. And all of these different ways to what? Distinguish your excellence over and against others so much that we take you out of the generalized population and put you in your own special classes. In Finland, where their scores are among the envy of the world, they do the opposite. They keep all the children in the same space, and they have the gifted students help the students who are struggling. We separate them, and so there's a lot there. In place of competitive schooling, Einstein believed society was best served by adopting a philosophy of education centered on honoring and developing the individual. Interesting for a socialist to say, but apparently individualism and socialism, for at least his conception of socialism, they were part and parcel of the same thing, while also at the same time balancing out the development of the individual by instilling those individuals with a basic awareness of their social and ethical responsibilities. Quote, for a community, Einstein wrote, of standardized individuals without personal originality and personal aims would be a poor community without possibilities for development. On the contrary, the aim must be the training of independently acting and thinking individuals who, however, see in the service of the community their highest life problem, end quote. And again, we are taught that one must choose to either pursue one's own best interests or the interests of the community, but they're mutually exclusive. Einstein, drawing on his experience of Judaism and the philosophy of both personal intellectual development, but also a commitment to the community, saw no contradiction in attaining both of those aims, and instead saw in them mutual development. Einstein believed that schools could play a key role in combating conformist thought and behavior. In place of standardization and competition, we should stimulate the natural love of learning, he thought. He objected to dominant modes of schooling that alienated learners from the joys of knowledge, from the joys of learning, from the joys of discovery, as if that was something separate from the goal of learning. Quote, the most important motive for work in the school and in life, Einstein shared, is the pleasure in work, pleasure in its result, and the knowledge of the value of the result to the community. He was, in a word, intrinsically motivated, not extrinsically with rewards and promises of something afterwards, or Jolly Ranchers to the first person who can get the right answer. Einstein understood that independent humanistic thought not only facilitated the fulfillment of individual human potential, but also enabled the flourishing of our larger communities. A society of independent thinkers is a society capable of fostering positive social change and protecting humanity from the prominent inclination among social beings to defer to others, to follow with the popular opinion, to obey authority, to follow custom, even when it made no sense to do so. A critical consciousness infused with the insights of the humanities enables us to stand, Einstein teaches us, on our own two cognitive feet, instead of leaning on the easy and vaunted pillars of common sense, tradition, popular opinion, and external authority. Following many great thinkers before him, because Einstein read the great works of human history. He knew philosophy. He knew great literary works. He didn't just have his nose stuck in a scientific text, as too many of our scientists do, losing the bigger picture of not only the means of life, but also the ends. To what end? For what purpose do we strive to acquire this knowledge? Just for accolades? Just for success? Just for money? Or for some grander purpose? Albert Einstein recognized common sense as an obstacle to original thought and the pursuit of knowledge. In an interesting book written by Lincoln Barnett, The Universe and Dr. Einstein, he explained that Einstein viewed common sense as, quote, actually nothing more than a deposit of prejudices laid down in the mind prior to the age of 18. Every new idea one encounters in later years must combat this accretion of self-evident concepts. And it is because of Einstein's unwillingness ever to accept any unproven principle as self-evident that he was able to penetrate closer to the underlying realities of nature than any scientist before him, end quote. This is Barnett's understanding after talking with Einstein and studying his work of what made him such a great thinker, is that he knew how to interrogate common sense. Einstein's emphasis on independent thinking and education was in part shaped by a deep concern with what he perceived as the unthinking conformity exemplified in militarism. In The World as I See It, written in 1931, Albert Einstein wrote that a man can take pleasure in marching in fours to the strands of a band is enough to make me despise him. He has only been given his big brain by mistake. Unprotected spinum marrow was all he needed. This plague spot on civilization, by which he means the military system, ought to be abolished with all possible speed. Heroism on command, senseless violence, and all the loathsome nonsense that goes by the name of patriotism, how passionately I hate them. How vile and despicable seems war to me. I would rather be hacked to pieces than take part in such an abominable business, end quote. I'll put those words in my mouth. That's Albert Einstein. Einstein's criticism of militarism shaped his thinking about the ascendancy of right-wing forces in Israel in the middle of the 20th century. Though Einstein was a supporter, though some would say otherwise, he was a supporter of the Zionist movement to form a cultural homeland for the Jewish people and the British Mandate of Palestine. He was fiercely critical of what he described of, as I quote, fascism and terrorism of ascending political forces in Israel among Israelis in 1948. In a December 2nd, 1948 letter, Einstein and his co-signers, including the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who, as you know, is famous for coining this concept of the banality of evil after seeing Adolf Eichmann, that most banal of all war criminals who sent Jews to gas chambers as though he was signing a document order for another, slab of concrete to be placed on a floor, signed by thinkers including Einstein as well as Hannah Arendt. That letter expressed concern over the rise of right-wing Freedom Party in Israel. The signers explained that the Freedom Party was formed from, this is their words, a terrorist organization, and described its, quote, organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal as akin to that of the Nazi fascist parties. Those are their words. The signatories were particularly outraged by what? By the Deir Yassin massacre of April 9th, 1948, in which Israeli paramilitary fighters slaughtered more than 100 Palestinian Arab villagers who were living near Jerusalem. This despite the villagers having signed and adhered to a peace pact. They weren't involved in the ongoing fighting between some Arabs and the Israelis. The perpetrators, who supported forcefully evicting all Arabs because their conception of Zionism, very different than Einstein's, was a state of exclusively only the Jews, exaggerated the number of people who were killed, and touted the massacre, parading some prisoners through West Jerusalem where they were taunted and verbally and physically abused before they were finally killed. And the letter signed by these most laudable, noteworthy Jewish figures speaking out against the ascending fascist and terroristic forces in Israel as they saw them and described them. The letter read, "Most of the Jewish community was horrified at the deed, and the Jewish agency sent a telegram of apology to King Abdullah of Transjordan. But the terrorists," speaking of the terrorists among the Israeli Jews, "but the terrorists, far from being ashamed of their act, were proud of this massacre, publicized it widely, and invited all the foreign correspondents present in the country to view the heaped corpses and the general havoc of Deir Yassin," end quote. The leader of the Freedom Party, by the way, Menachem Begin, was a leader of one of the paramilitary forces involved in that massacre. Einstein and his fellow signatories called for Begin to be condemned as a fascist. Instead of being marginalized, know where Begin went? He went on to found the Likud party, which is presently Benjamin Netanyahu's party. And he became the 6th prime minister of Israel. And sadly, the massacre seemed to echo concerns Einstein articulated in a 1938 speech in favor of Zionism, in favor of a homeland for the Jewish people to come and live at peace, at one, together, not in a ethno-state, but in a shared community with Arabs. In his 1938 speech, Our Debt to Zionism, Einstein expressed his fears of the dangers of establishing an explicitly Jewish state with, quote, borders, an army. You already know what he thinks about armies. And a measure of temporal power, end quote. Einstein said that he feared, quote, the inner damage Judaism will sustain, especially from the development of a narrow nationalism within our ranks against which we have already had to fight strongly, even without a Jewish state, end quote. I will, just to be perfectly clear, eventually Einstein accepted the establishment of the Jewish state as a necessity. But you can see in his letters and his writing and his speaking out against what he described as fascist and terroristic forces among some Zionists, you can see his conflict, his opposition to nationalism. He was one of their early figures saying, Judaism teaches us what? It teaches us that there's a common humanity. It teaches us to speak against idolatry, which is one of the insights we get from the Old Testament, against idolatry. And you see this conflict in him emerge against nationalism, against ethnic identities, but also his longing for some sanctuary for the Jewish people while he condemned the fascistic and terroristic forces, but also saw a great need for the Jewish people to have a homeland. So it's really fascinating to study him from that perspective as well. But Einstein wasn't done speaking out against war, as you know. because following the detonation of the atomic bomb, Einstein spoke out with figures like Bertrand Russell against militarism, against warfare, and he helped produce the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, calling for nothing short of the abolition of war. And why there's so much more to say about what Einstein offers us in terms of understanding why we need to have a robust knowledge base upon which to build the sciences. He speaks in favor of the priority and the primacy of ethics to guide our scientific inquiries and our politics. He speaks of the dangers of nationalism and how we can be sucked into it and let it overtake our common humanity. There's so much more to learn from Einstein than just his science, and that is not to turn him into a saint. I mean, if you look at his personal life, if you look at his absence from his children, if you look at the relationships, I mean, if you want to call them that, with his romantic partners, there's much to critique about this person. So I'm not here to present him as a paragon of virtue, but I do think that he has a great deal of insight and wisdom to share with us. And I think that recognizing that one of the greatest scientists in human history says that we must have a generalized knowledge base, we must prioritize ethics, and we must recognize the value of poetry and philosophy, and yes, even religion distilled of its superstition and its dogma. And then finally, I'll leave you with these words that I think ought to stay with us today as we work out our allegiances. What is it that we most fully commit ourselves to? Which side are we on in the present conflicts of the day? Where will we be standing when we have our time and age evaluated by history? He said in that Russell-Einstein Manifesto, as Dr. King would later echo, and you might know these words best stated by Dr. King, but we find them in the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, and I'll leave you with these words. He issued the question before humanity in a stark and direct manner and asked the question, shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? People will not face this alternative because it is so difficult to abolish war, end quote. And I think if we take nothing more from Einstein, we will take the importance of asking that question. Will we abolish the human race, or will we find a way to be the first to take that step? Because we can always wait for someone else to do it, but will we take that first step to work toward abolishing war? Thank you.